Very proud to have them. So we got a lot of different people here that come in with a lot of different experiences, which I love. Um, People are showing up for different contexts, but clearly drawn here by something, right? And something similar. And I want to name something before we begin. Just doing this, right? Pausing, introducing ourselves, naming what brought us here, a small act of acknowledgement, that to me is a simple trauma sensitive intervention. If you start where you are, not just jumping straight into content, I'm not going to monologue you to death. I really recognize that each of you are a whole person. You've arrived from somewhere, you're carrying something, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm here today in conversation with the wonderful Stephen Shedlesky. I think we can call him Shed, folks. He is a speaker and he has written a book, very interrelated, Speak Up Culture. And really glad to be here. And I just want to name a couple things we're going to explore. We're going to explore what leaders are navigating right now. I've been working on this book for many years, but 2026 could not be, unfortunately or fortunately, more ripe for this conversation. I want to talk about how we've been misreading some of the things we're seeing at work and what small shifts that we can make to change the experiences we're having at work. So let's approach this with curiosity over certainty. I like to say in all my trainings, it's all about progress, not perfection. There's no perfect answers here or perfect questions. And just on that note of questions, we'll have plenty of time for your questions for me after Shed and I have a little bit of a dialogue where he asked me some questions about the book. Okay, so just so you know, if you've got questions, we're here for it. We've got a big chunk of time for that. Final note before I hand it over to you, Shed. I want to offer a little brief care note. Topics we're exploring today: burnout, stress, team dynamics, emotional, psychological safety. They can touch us. They can touch some personal experiences, things that can feel close to home. I know sometimes they do for me. Of course, that's not a reason to pull back. Let's be fully in the conversation, but it's a reason to take care of yourselves, right? As we go in, if something lands in a way that's, a lot, it's okay to step away from the camera. I'm not going to be offended, and bio breaks are also welcome, by the way. That's totally fine. I just want to know that you get to decide how you engage today. I welcome all of it. That choice itself is a small act of trauma-sensitive self-leadership. So with all that being said, Shed, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Hi, all. There are a lot of folks here that I have not had a chance to meet yet, so great to be with you, and some folks, especially from our Page Two community that I know well and very well. But a delight to be here with you, Adriana, and this amazing community of leaders and people, and to launch this amazing set of pieces of paper that are just wonderful into the world. So, congratulations, and thank you for the honor to be a part of this and to be part of the book as well. Yeah, Kristen's rocking the book as well. Love to see it. So you reached out a number of months ago, and I'm like, okay, fellow Page Two author, check. And I'm like, trauma sensitivity at work. I'm like, what's that about? And am I willing to be affiliated with it? And as I dove into the work, I'm like, hang on a second. There's actually a lot of intersectionality, and there's a lot that had both of us nodding our heads as we were chatting about our shared work, albeit coming from different, sometimes similar, but also different experiences and lenses. So it's great to hop into this conversation with you about a topic that you know a lot more about than I do. So I'm keen to learn from you. As Adriana said, so what we're going to do is if you have questions or comments as we're going, feel free to raise your hand if you know the Zoom function to raise your hand, wave your hands like wacky inflatable tubes, and hopefully we'll see you. Or you can come off mute as well, or use the chat and ask a question. We are going to have a formal time for some Q&A toward the end. So if you're not quite sure when to interject, there will be a point for sure, but we want to make this conversational and speak with rather than speak to. So you're welcome to chime in whenever. As well, if you prefer to ask a question but would rather it be anonymous, that is very welcome as well. So feel free to send either myself or Adriana a anonymous direct message if that would feel better, and we can share your question on your behalf. So that's an offer to you as well. Okay, enough blabbing and housekeeping. Did I anything I missed, um, Adriana, before we hop in and start chatting trauma?
I think we're good to go.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so you did allude to this around this has been brewing within you for many years and has reached us now in this moment and in this year. But why this book and why now?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. As you alluded to, this partly came from my own lived experience. As I said, years of running an empty as a recovering lawyer, representing victims of sexual harassment, discrimination, a lot of heavy things, trying to achieve that elusive perfection for myself, my clients. We know that's a dead end. I then worked with a team, a mental health and wellness team of all things, ironically, that was burning out until my body sent me signals I couldn't ignore. And that's, I think, resonates for a couple of people I've spoken to about the book. And I was advocating for the very things that I needed. I couldn't see it at the time, right? And unfortunately, my experience, it took burnout to start connecting these dots, right? And then through my work, though, with clients as a consultant, I saw that a lot of the frameworks that I used in, anti-harassment is what I started in, sexual violence prevention, were often the same ones that helped me understand both my own reactions as a leader and in other leaders and teams. I'll speak more about that later. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it anymore. These tools are actually more widely applicable than just siloed in some of the work I was doing on harassment prevention. So all this to say, with the why now, Shed,
Hmm.
the gap. So there's still very little research and practical guidance on these links, right? These intersections between workplace culture, leadership, and trauma specifically, right? And yet we know in our work that a lot of times leaders reach for the same solutions. At least a lot of my clients do, right? There's a resilience webinar. I was a facilitator for many of those 1 hour lunch and learns, God knows, right? No shame, no blame, the wellness app, the leave policy. Of course, these are important, but they don't alone get to the root of many problems I've seen in my experience and in my clients. Not because leaders don't care, but because there's a lot of band-aids where the root causes are often deeper. So I also found in my consulting work that a lot of the tools that travel best are the ones where people don't have to name their trauma, because that's a scary word, just partly why I wrote this book. I was often giving leaders trauma education through what I'd say the back door, human-centered communication skills. It was landing. But that told me something important over the years, that this work actually belongs in leadership development. It just needed the right language. And with the why now, I mean, a couple reasons. Generally, through research, we know that at least 70% of people experience trauma in their lifetime. That's a WHO statistic. And those are the people that report it, right? It's in every team. This is what it means. It's in every team, every meeting, every difficult conversation. You're going to have some team leaders and some team members that have experienced it. So we don't wait for, a car crash, right, to teach defensive driving. So I'm thinking, why do we wait for crisis to teach people how nervous systems work, right, in the space of leadership? One reason I wrote this book too is that trauma has been siloed a lot into therapy offices or become really clinical or in crisis context. All very important. But if we're saying, Shed, like 70% of people carry it, I think it belongs in every conversation in leadership and how we work together, including communication tools, how we give feedback, etc. Then the final why now, and we'll move on, is that, it goes without saying 2026. I didn't know that would be out in 2026. More than ever, we're navigating a wave of complexity that's unprecedented. A lot of my clients are dealing with budget cuts, layoffs, complexity. So nervous systems are on high alert, whether we name it that way or not. So I feel that this book gives leaders a language and tools for that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I have noticed that my nervous system has been on high alert, but just because you've mentioned it, that's the only reason. No. Very good. You make me think there's the quote from Desmond Tutu. I actually put it as one of the chapter epigraphs in my book. We both had the chance to work with Kendra Ward on the Page Two team, who we both adore. But the quote is from Desmond Tutu: "There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in."
Yeah.
And I think you're speaking a lot to that root cause analysis I also agree with you that, okay, the vast majority, dare we say, everyone has these things going on within them, whether they're aware of it or not. Call it trauma, call it whatever you want, that are running the show as much as we think we're in charge sometimes. We're not always in charge of our reactions, but we can be in charge of our response. So very good. Um, which parts of the book, concept stories, which parts reflect what leaders are grappling with most right now, and as you look ahead? Mute. You're on mute. You can't be on mute.
I
You're
can't be on
yeah, no,
mute. I
no.
know. I have so many things to say. I don't want to interrupt you, Shed. Okay. So one of the things I think is really important here, and we can get into this too, is that we said, leaders keep reaching for the same solutions. One of the things I push back on in the book a little bit is that burnout, which is on the rise. There's a lot of statistics we can talk all day about those. It's on the rise, right? So that's one thing. I push back on the idea that burnout is a personal failing, and a lot of people come to talk to me about why that's a bit of a bomb for me. Or for them in their experience of burnout, right? There's a resilience webinar. A lot of the things like that are targeted at the individual, right? They go towards the individual where the conditions, including the culture, workload, all of these things remain untouched. So you can send someone home on leave. I've been there. Bring them back and rinse and repeat the whole cycle again, right? If you don't see burnout as something more structural, I think it's a both and. It's the people and the workplace need healing, as I say in the book, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So it's both, right? It's a both and kind of thing. But if we keep locating the problem of burnout inside the person alone, we're going to let the system off the hook, right? And we're going to keep having this vicious cycle. And it's become exacerbated these days, this cycle, with some of the conditions I cited earlier. Um, One of the things that I think is finally coming into the conversation around leadership, around emotional intelligence, Susan David, that's been in the vernacular. I think more and more leaders are talking about the importance of doing their own inner work, of being like a self-awareness, right? We know that that's really important, emotional intelligence. But it's one of the most overlooked pieces when it's like high pressure environments, right? But trauma sensitivity begins with the leader, not the team. Like I can't attune to your nervous system if I don't know anything about my own reactions. And this is another thing I like to say, it's not a soft idea. I would argue that it's foundational to everything else in leadership. It's an anchor, right? I tell a story about like Elias, one of the leaders in the book. He's like sharp, strategic, well respected, one of these sharks, that we hold up as a model. But his team goes quiet. He shuts down new ideas. No one can disagree with Elias, right? And then somebody comes to him one day and he tells him, I feel shut down and people disagree with you, right? He, it's not what all leaders do, but what some leaders do, if he sits there, he traces it back to some early experiences where being wrong meant being unsafe. And that wiring comes into the workplace as a leader. And he unintentionally shifted and shaped the culture as psychologically unsafe because his whole wiring was playing out on the team. So this is why I think it's really important and often overlooked that this wiring doesn't leave itself at the door and it shapes your team's culture if you haven't addressed it as a leader. So I
yeah.
think those things are really important. Um, and one last thing, because everybody's attention span these days is, zero. I know mine has shrunk too. I know leaders are hungry for small, concrete shifts. Like, what can I do now? And what I argue about in trauma sensitivity is it's not a grand project. It can start with where you're at. You can start with things like small micro moments over time, meeting hygiene, how we debrief, how we give feedback, whether your culture normalizes, I need a moment or not, I need a pause. Just these like practical choices that I argue we can integrate into how we shape meetings, for example, that respect how nervous systems work.
Yeah. Great. This is probably a 101 question. It might not be relevant for the group, but I'm also mindful of people tuning in to the recording. Just define trauma sensitivity, trauma informed. Like
Yeah,
just give us those foundational definitions because that might help us anchor in the conversation that we're having.
totally. Okay. I really like that you asked that because I grappled with Kendra about the language. Okay. So trauma sensitivity, I put it here because I knew you'd ask that question. So I want to make sure I get the definition that I put in the book, right? Here's what we say what I say in the book. Trauma sensitivity means understanding the potential impacts of trauma on people's behavior and well-being, including your own, and then responding to those impacts with greater care, clarity, and intention. So it's about noticing, honoring, and responding to the needs and emotions of others. And it's a capacity, I would argue, that every strong leader and inclusive workplace really needs to cultivate, right? It's not a new, trauma sensitivity is not a new term. It was borrowed from education in the States too. Jeremy, you might know this on the line. Trauma sensitive school is one where, all students feel safe, welcomed, and empowered, right? And we can apply that same principle to teams. I deliberately use the term trauma sensitivity, which some may or may not agree with. There's not agreement unilaterally in the trauma world about what to use. Because the latter, trauma informed, which is similar, trauma informed can be defined in many ways, but often it's defined as, knowing about trauma and also the ability to apply its principles to change processes in the organization, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people call it trauma responsive. There's a whole rabbit hole of language we can go down on that. But the latter, trauma informed, trauma responsive, I've seen it as a practitioner applied in ways that can be scary or clinical or even disconnected from day-to-day leadership for folks. And people's shoulders might go up with trauma, like where it's very clinical or I need an expert. And that's not to say that sometimes mental health professionals aren't important or clinicians aren't important. But for me, being trauma sensitive is not just also about having the knowledge about it. It's about embodying the principles in those everyday moments, right?
Yeah.
And you can't get there from one training session, like, hey, tick trauma-informed certificate, right? Or trauma-sensitive, rather, certificate. For me, I believe it needs to be practiced in everyday work life, influencing practices, communication, also policy. As you know, in the book, I talk about policy, but often it's in those micro behaviors. Important reframe. I use the word sensitivity to take back sensitivity and say, like, look, it's a leadership competency. I wanted to challenge the notion that it's a nice to have or that it's something to play down, like you're too sensitive, and rather something to harness almost as an attribute, I think, as you say in your book, for leaders. So I was like, let's reclaim sensitivity.
Nice. There's an awareness, there's a development, there's a building of practices and muscles. I love that. Like, informed can be potentially passive, sensitive is active, is what I'm
That's how
hearing
I
from
see
you.
it.
Yeah,
That's how I
that's
see
great.
it. Yeah,
There's we committed that we would go off script, so let's do it.
let's do it.
Lasha just asked a great question in the chat that I think is just perfect to dig into right now. Could you please mention the importance of cultural nuances when talking about understanding employee trauma? Working in a global organization, I know it's quite difficult and different to have people start speaking about something. Love to hear your thoughts there, Adriana.
Great. Thanks, Lasha. Gamarjova, Lasha, by the way, I know Lasha is a client from Finca in Georgia. So great to see you here, even though I know it's late for you, Lasha. So appreciate that. Cultural, I think, first of all, just as a general term, one of the first trauma-informed principles for me in the book I talk about, Lasha, is cultural humility. The fact is that I've worked and we've worked together cross-culturally. Things are going to land differently in different contexts, including language, including your entry point into things, including whether or not you're more directive in your approach to things or whether or not you're a little bit more facilitator oriented. So I think first of all, I'm really glad you named that because, Lasha, you've named one of the key pillars of trauma sensitivity or just being trauma informed is cultural nuance, is the fact that you have to approach folks where they are. And even people's experience of what trauma is or what the nervous system looks like is going to be different cross-culturally. And one of the ways I approach it is language, I believe, is important, Lasha. So sometimes the word trauma is a little bit too heavy. So often what I've done, and Lasha, we worked together, right, before, and sometimes we work together on things like gender equity at work. But there are certain things we talk about in terms of the culture that actually have a trauma sensitive lens to them, particularly around, how to receive complaints, around harassment, how women are treated in the workplace, and, discussions we have around identity, but we didn't use the word trauma. So I'm not saying we have to shy away from that, Lasha, but I am saying that we can be conscious, I think, of language. And when I go into an organization, I want to know where folks are at with that, because I don't want people to be scared before we even jump into it. I want to humanize the experience a little bit. There's way more I could say, Lasha, but just to say, you raised a key pillar, I think, of being trauma informed.
Beautiful. Thank you for that comment and question, Lasha. Keep it coming, crew. Um, I have a I have a question. Again, we promised we'd go off script. So, as I was learning more about the book and reading the book, the word healing comes up a lot.
Mhm.
And I think there's sort of two perspectives of healing. There's like awareness and healing of a culture, of a workplace culture, of an organization or a community, sort
Yeah.
of an awareness that we might be doing harm to one another, even if it is unintended,
Mhm.
and like cultural healing, right? And then there's the conversation of, well, who's responsible for that? And, is it senior leaders or is it, employees? And I think the answer is yes. It's probably at least 51% on the side of senior leaders, but it's everyone's opportunity and responsibility,
Yeah.
potentially. Love to hear comments there. My
Yeah.
question for you, though, is that when it comes to our own individual trauma, of
Mhm.
which at least 70% of us have, and, I think we can say that that's a generous understatement.
Yeah.
Where's the onus or where's the responsibility when it comes to our own journey of healing?
Mm.
Who's responsible for that work?
Biggies. Okay, so let's go with the two parts. Great, great. Big bombs. Love it, Shed. Okay, so let's unpack the healing one, which I think we could talk to for a while. So repeat for me though what we want to get at with the healing, what you're really wanting to.
Well, so really, it's who. So when it comes to individual healing,
Yeah,
where's the responsibility?
yeah.
So I show up to work. There's trauma that's in the driver's seat, whether I want it to be or not, and it's affecting how I'm showing up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jesse.
Always with the small, easy question, Shed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But so where does the onus, where does the responsibility lie?
Hmm.
Like one of the other things I hear is there are a lot of younger folks joining the workforce who may not have some of the human skills of patience or resilience
Hmm.
or stick-to-itiveness or whatever. And we'll hear from senior leaders, oh, this young generation. Like, who is responsible for healing and growth?
Right.
Is it the individual or is it the workplace? And I'm on purpose asking a question with binary answers that maybe
You
the
got
answer is
me.
not binary.
Yeah, you got me there because, of course, I'm allergic to the binary. And part of the book is about breaking the binary of that, right? And I think we might say, and many senior leaders would probably say, often it's the individual, right? And
Mm,
that's one thing I want to push back on. I think there's a
mm,
lot of reasons for that. There's no blame in that. I think it's often how we see mental health at work, right? I talk about Gabor Mate's, work too, the fact that we can tell she's just anxious. She's got depression, right? Which I'm not undermining that, but often we're describing descriptions that quietly place a problem inside the person, right? That's like a larger discussion that we can have, but we can often, say it's the person to do their own individual healing. Um, why I think this is the annoying facilitator answer, it's a both and situation, Shed. So there's the individual that needs to do some of the work coming in. Um, and then you bring an individual, let's say there's an individual who comes in with a background. Maybe they've got their own mental health history. Maybe they've got cultural background. Many of us have intergenerational trauma. We're carrying baggage with us. Maybe you've, gone through a breakup, all sorts of things that you're bringing into this workplace. Then you come into this workplace and you have no control over your workload, deadlines looming, layoffs, et cetera, toxic boss, discrimination, attitude. All this is like a quiet recipe, this like messy stew where it's not just the individual, the individual symptoms are exacerbated, right, by the workplace conditions that they're put in. So it becomes a both and. It's almost like not a Venn diagram, but it's a little bit more circular than binary for me, right? It becomes this cycle. So I think it's a both and situation. And I think one thing I really wanted to gently, maybe not so gently, push back on in the book is that I see a lot of debates with that binary question in mind, right? Especially on social media, which is binary. Either, we've got the structural folks in the DEI world. I've got my hand in there, and they're like, it's the structure, it's the workplace conditions, it's the discrimination. Yes. And there are individuals coming into it with their own trauma responses and their own history. And they may not have the tools to be able to access the healing they need, but I do think there is our own responsibility to be able to access that healing as well. So I
Yeah.
think maybe that's a cop out. I don't know, but I'm always a layered thinker. I can never go binary. And I think it does a disservice to the discussion not to make it complicated. It's both.
Yeah.
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 No, I'm completely aligned there. It is a both and. It truly is a both and. So I'm good there. Are there questions or pieces we've yet to cover that you want to, or we can go to our question bank, and as well we can open up to questions and comments that folks have in the chat or coming off mute as well. But things we've yet to cover, Adriana, that you'd be
Oh,
remiss
like the
if we did.
questions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know Rika's got a question, so we could park that. Thanks, Rika, for sure. Are there any questions? Because, we planted some questions for Shed to ask, and I want to see if there's any good ones for folks here. I think we talked a bit. One of the questions we had was about, practicing trauma sensitivity. I think we went there. So I'm just kind of
hmm
looking.
hmm
Um, maybe, there's a question about everyday practices, and I could give a couple examples that might help
Great.
people.
Yeah, and then we have some questions stacking up in the chat, so we can go
That
there next, and then I
okay,
can always look through our questions as well. But yeah,
sounds good.
let's go to the daily practices.
Okay, great. So I'll talk about a couple simple shifts because that's the first question everybody asks. The action, right? Go to action. What does it look like in practice? So there's one particular chapter I'll draw from. I talk a lot about policy, but also cultural shifts that you can, like small cultural shifts that are significant, that are trauma sensitive in nature, that are draw from trauma informed practices and principles. One of them that people don't like to hear is slowing down. And when I'm saying slowing down, I don't mean consensus paralysis. That's what I call it. I've seen a lot of organizations get stuck waiting for 100% agreement, 150% agreement. And I don't mean slowing down for 3 days. I know decisiveness, particularly in a lot of the spaces I operate on, and folks on the line do humanitarian, you got to go quick. But what I draw on in the book that I think is really important is this idea of slowing down and learning a little bit about Daniel, I think we pronounce it Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking. I talk about that in the book, right? System 1 is fast, automatic, reactive, bias prone. We do it a lot at work, and sometimes we need it. System 2 is more deliberate, more accurate, a little bit more. We need it for strategic planning. We need it for complexity. We need both, right? And what I hear happening a lot, we got both of them operating. People often go to system 1. We don't have time for system 2 to come into the fore. We don't give ourselves enough time to slow down even a little bit. And little practices like checking in on workflow, like a lot of times I do decision trees for clients, or things like that, or workflows. Just check-ins on how processes are working can help that system 2 catch up. And I want to name something. I call it chronic group anxiety. I think Steve Cuss also speaks about it in his book that I cite, false urgency. So there's often this pushback I get from clients like, we can't slow down, with their hands up like this, which is a sure sign that there's some reactivity going on, right? We can't slow down, right? So there's often this anxiety that makes things that feel urgent when they actually aren't, right? And I've seen that a lot in my teams. Ironically, slowing down with these micro slowing down that you can build into a team meeting can actually lead to better, more decisive outcomes. Because if you slow down enough too, your executive function goes back online and you can make a better decision. So that's the slowing down. It's not as scary as it might sound. Check-ins is another one. It's used in a lot of different practices, but it's more than how are you, right? A real check-in is an intentional kind of moment to check in. And often what I've done in teams is, just build it into your meeting infrastructure, a small check-in. It's not anything super deep, but, you can make a creative, low barrier. One of the ones I like is a 1 to 5 energy check. You don't have to ask people how they're feeling because most people don't want to say how they're feeling. But you say like 1 to 5 energy check. I'm feeling low, 1, 5, really ramped up. Even that is a moment of connection and it's a moment of slowing down and safety. One, I think you cite this in your book too, is what color are you today? That I would call a trauma sensitive practice too. You don't have to name your feelings, but it's so there's a lot of overlap there, right? It's just a way to create a little bit more safety. Deceptively simple, but I've seen it work even with more stoic team members. And one final practice I want to name about meeting hygiene that I've learned, sending the agenda in advance. Very rarely done, very overlooked thing. Surprises can be surprisingly triggering and activating for folks. When they know a little bit, including there's a check-in coming, it can slow things down. It can make people participate a little bit more.
Yeah. And even from a personality style, I found like a meaningful pre-read or an agenda, especially for more introverted, reserved, analytical folks
Yeah.
who have less of the propensity to be quick on their feet or extroverted or charismatic, really helps them bring their thinking to the meeting and not have to be on the spot when they're not comfortable doing so. So
Exactly.
love those. Yeah. And even like a slowdown. Hey, everyone, let's take a 5 second breath. Or we don't have this in the agenda, but we're taking a 5 minute break so that we can come back and look at this from a different perspective before we make a call. I'm hearing are some of these practices,
Yes.
Adriana, which are great. Um, okay, Rika has a great question here. Let's go to Rika's question. Thank you for putting this important work out into the world. I agree. Here's the question. How do we prioritize trauma sensitivity and broader self-well-being in corporate culture in light of increasing budget cuts that we are also familiar with? Maybe you answered this in the book, but haven't gotten to it yet. So yeah, it's the how do we take this work with the inevitable, uncertain,
Mhm.
time resource constraint reality that many of us are facing day to day right now.
Great. And there's so much I could say there, Rika. We've experienced this firsthand, I think. Pressure it creates recipe for trauma responses to come into the workplace, no question, freezing and all this kind of stuff. So I think just the awareness of that in and of itself is the first really good thing. And that's why I spend so much time in the book for people to understand that those kinds of responses show up in the workplace. The people understand that that's happening. Um, I think another practice, 'cause I've worked with clients and organizations firsthand that are experiencing layoffs and all sorts of stuff. One trauma sensitive practice, and it's a trauma informed principle, is transparency can go a long way. Okay. It doesn't mean things are perfect. Layoffs are what they are. You can't necessarily control the outcome always. But what I've seen makes a huge difference. It goes a long way. Is I've experienced organizations and clients that have layoffs with very little transparency, which produces, and change in and of itself can produce trauma responses, but it produces distrust, it produces friction, with a lack of information, there feels like a lack of control. People's agency is taken away, and the friction and the trauma responses abound. So, the more transparency, I think, the better. I think transparency is a leadership practice generally, but it's an important trauma sensitive one in times of uncertainty. And I would add, it also means that leaders don't have to have it all figured out. So, it doesn't mean you say you can be transparent about what's going on when it's going on and what's working and not working, right? So I think those are a couple practices. One thing I also, uh, propose to, I recommend to leaders is, be authentic too. This doesn't mean jumping everything, on your team either. You want to regulate yourself and your own emotions during these times. But I think being a little bit in it with the team and being able to be upfront about that and not having all the answers goes a long way. So those are a few things. I'm sure we can't figure it out today, Rika, but thank you so much.
Yeah. I there's a equation for vulnerability that I have because we're all said, be vulnerable. Vulnerability is a leadership competency. And I'm like, well, it's vulnerability plus context. Because
Yes.
vulnerability without context could be oversharing, but vulnerability with context, it's what is appropriate. I actually think it's something you modeled really well with the writing of this book, and it was a curiosity I had of you, Adriana, so we can go here now, which is you reference some of your own trauma around, been there, done that in terms, not been there, done that, but you're coming from a place of experience and credibility and authority from writing this book. But how did you determine with this notion of vulnerability plus context equals superpower. You mentioned your own early child, your early experience of trauma, your vicarious trauma through work as a lawyer, and much of the client work that you've done, intergenerational trauma, some of which we share. But how did you determine? And I know it was a journey figuring out what to include of your own trauma versus is this going to serve the reader? Is this going to serve me? I'm curious around some of the own your own vulnerability and context as you wrote the book of what to include and what not to.
Right. Well, we've got page 2 on the line here, and they were part of this process because when I originally came in, when you're a writer, originally, hey, Jesse, when you come in, it's not all fully formed. I had to get it out there, right? And I included all sorts of things that, things together. I think one of the early things I did with the editor, which was really important, was to think about my ideal reader and think about who do I want to serve here, right? So when I started thinking about that as like the driving force in what I needed to include, I started asking a different set of questions. It wasn't, I'm not writing a memoir. That wasn't my intention. It wouldn't serve the reader. I wanted to ask them, what would that person need to know next? And that's what the editor, Kendra, helped me do. What do they need to
Mm,
know next? What would they not need to know next? What would be a digression? And then let's be honest, we don't want to re-traumatize somebody reading a book about trauma. I was very cautious. I don't want to joke about it, but you got to joke,
yeah,
I
yeah,
could have. So I think it's really important. You mentioned about vulnerability plus context. I would say one of the other parts of that is emotional regulation. It's not being authentic. It's not walking on eggshells. In fact, it's actually knowing what to share given the context, like you said, Shed. And
yeah,
I learned that through the process of iterative editing down. I wanted to make sure that my reader felt cared for, but also got what they needed, not what they didn't need. And
yeah,
lastly, I would say everybody that's reading this book comes to me with different experiences, and that's awesome. If I had talked just about myself, I don't think they would have put themselves in the equation as much. It would have
yeah,
been more about Adriana, and that would be okay, but it would be a memoir.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, really good. And the reason I asked the question is not only for us learning about your experience and like bringing that vulnerability plus context equation to life. I'm also thinking of Rika's question and transparency, and for us to go away and go, what is responsible for me in the role that I'm in as leader, as parent, as coach, as whoever you might be? What is the responsible level of transparency? Of vulnerability, what is appropriate, what is the right next thing to share or ask given the role that I'm in now, or this conversation now. So that's also what I'm hearing from your answer there, Adriana. Um, Love to. So there's another question here from Alan, which I'm going to ask. We have just about 15 minutes left because the time is flying because we are having fun. Cute doggy Jeremy, thanks for
Hey,
bringing pets.
Jeremy.
Pets are welcome.
Pets are welcome. I forgot to mention.
Yeah, particularly cute ones, but that's subjective. But objectively, that is a cute dog. Um, Okay, so yes, please, we got 15 minutes left. Please use that chat. Raise your hand, come off mute. We'd love to hear your voice and hear what questions, reflections you have as well. Here's one from Alan. So, if an organization has a supportive, I love how supportive is in quotations there. We can interpret that as we wish, approach to well-being, clear policies, effective resources, and transparent communication on leadership and employee roles, should managers or even coworkers be held accountable? As an example, in performance metrics for their team's overall well-being. Boom.
Boom. Again, Alan's another one who asks the easy question, Shed. Love it.
Yeah.
So, Alan, just to clarify, is that kind of a question related to like what is the employee's responsibility? Just to clarify, Alan, make sure I'm getting at what
And
you're
and feel free, Alan, if you'd like,
if
come
you
off mute and add
sure.
add commentary to your question if you'd like.
Yeah.
Sure. I'll happy to do that. I guess it's both. It's really the question is aimed at the manager or supervisor, and should they be held accountable for their team's well-being, provided all of the
Ah,
supportive measures are in place, clear communication, et cetera, et cetera.
mm,
But it also goes to what you said before about the individual's role, and maybe that wasn't as explicit as I could have made it in the question.
mm.
So assuming all of those supports are in place and there's been communication and there's a plan, what if the individual doesn't fulfill their part in the plan? So it's sort of both then.
Yeah, I think that, thanks, Alan. I think that is making me think back to the question Jed had about whose role is it? And again, I'll have that annoying facilitator answer of the both and, right? I think it's both. I think it depends on the context, Alan, because as we know, I'm very context specific with my clients. Sometimes clients say, we've got all the policies in the world. Our leave policy is great. And we've got no problems. What's going on that nobody's coming forward, or what's going on that we're having burnout? And sometimes when we drill down, we actually see that the application or the implementation of the policies, like the actual policies, are look okay, but the application and the skills around the manager, for example, around how they speak to people or how safe they are to come forward to, are not so clear. That's often been my experience. So that's where I think the workplace does have a role. I think honestly depends on the context. Sometimes, of course, you're going to have performance management. This is not my book is not against performance management per se. It's just putting more language and understanding around what's coming up for the employee, I think. Anyway, so it's a complicated answer, I think. But I think really, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
I have a couple things to add or share if I can on this.
Sure.
So what like I it used to be, I think, that 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, the promise of employment was tenure, that like
Yeah.
gold watch. And I think that promise has shifted. But I do think a promise can be growth. Like
Mm,
we don't know how long this organization will exist due to mergers and acquisitions and market conditions and all this. And career has shifted, but I do think that we can promise or say we will create the conditions for growth, which means as an organization, we need to take responsibility for our culture, but it also means as individuals, we need to take
yeah.
responsibility for our growth and step into it. That's why I do think it is a both
It's
and.
both and. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also a case of a company called NextJump that's based out of New York that evaluates their leaders 50% on team performance, very hard data, and 50% on leadership well-being. And there is a case where they demoted a leader who had top performance but awful peer review scores.
Wow.
And they went, great results, but they're driven, not cultivated. You can either leave or you can re-enroll in our leadership boot camp, learn what it really means to be a leader here, and earn that VP role again by doing the right behaviors and the right things and making it sustainable. So I love that, 50% hard data, but 50% what does the team actually want to work for that leader?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
that.
Totally.
Awesome. Okay. More coming in here. I'm just going to read this out loud because it's such a good love note from Jesse. Our page two team feels that Adriana wrote a book that serves the reader beautifully while also feeling personal. It's not a memoir, but it feels so authentic to her. Rock on. You can hear her authentic voice and wisdom
Sorry,
throughout
I
its
didn't.
grounding.
Hearts. I didn't mean to
How
use them.
embarrassing. No, it's all good. When you just if you do certain things, the emojis naturally occur. So it fortunately it did match your mood there, Adriana. Question from Sandra. The language in the I don't hear you side of your framework is so normalized, I find not just in the workplace, but in everyday life too. Things like you are overreacting or it was just a joke and you're too sensitive. How do you help people recognize and unlearn that kind of language when it's so deeply woven into how we communicate with each other? Great
Boom.
question.
Great. Yeah, Sandra's also the one with the real easy questions. So, but thank you so much, Sandra. And I think I will note that I hear you, I don't hear you has been something I've been getting a lot of feedback on. And it was originally a tool that I worked with for to help managers receive complaints of sexual violence, but it applies broadly, very broadly to interpersonal interactions and all sorts of interactions at work. So that's interesting. So yes, you're overreacting. It was just a joke. I think we've all been there, me included. We've probably said these things, right? You're too sensitive. That language feels normal because it has been normalized. It's everywhere. And that's kind of why I name it, right? So one of the things I think is important, Sandra, is awareness is number one, right? I think just the awareness that these phrases are so normalized, but they actually subtly dismiss a concern. And they can actually replicate original injuries, especially if you're talking about something really more complex at work. But even for, interpersonal conversations, right? It can actually leave the person feeling more unheard and dismissed, telling someone the reality isn't real, right? And when you start to understand, then that's how the language often lands, something can shift. So I think that's one point. I think it's important to note that this is socialization. Like, this isn't about character. This is what I always say in a lot of my more thorny trainings that I do. Minimizing, deflecting, what we can say, victim blaming even. These aren't always malicious necessarily. They're learned behaviors, right? And they're socialized. So what I'm modeling here, the goal isn't shame, to say, hey, don't say those things. Although the goal is that we like to say things that are different, but it's really interrupting it. Once people understand these responses are socialized, there's something that can become more unlearned, this reframe. So that's kind of why I put it in a table. Like, what can you say instead to validate someone's experience a little bit more, right? What's another thing that you can say? And I think one thing I'll add, Sandra, is that it gets personal when we understand our own nervous system. Like, trauma sensitivity actually helps us recognize, it's helped me recognize that when I'm using those "I don't hear you" in reaction to other people, I might be activated. I might be feeling defensive. I might be in flight. I can't hear what someone else is saying. I got to make them wrong, right? These are often language we use when we want to dismiss someone else when we're in our own trauma response. So I think it helps people understand, and leaders included, I need to take a step back here if I really want to take this complaint seriously. Take a step back, to rejig and see how I want to respond here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra.
Yeah. And I'm even hearing like there's sort of three positions. There's the person who said something, there's the person who receives it, and even an ally or someone who observes it, and the different plays or things one could do that, I'm sure we've all been in the situation where we say something and you're like, that didn't land the way I wanted it to
Right.
land. And that's the moment to be like, hey, just checking in. I said something wasn't my intention, but I feel like I may have. Are you okay? What's up? Right. And
Yep.
you can sort of own it. There's if you receive it, do you feel comfortable saying, hey, I know maybe it wasn't your intention, but when you said that, it made me feel, and try to
Yep.
own it. Or if you observe it and how you can healthily intervene, productively, generatively intervene as well. Another question here, and then we're nearing our time. But hey, there's a book that you can dive into to learn much more, which I
Yes.
hope you will do, trauma sensitivity at work. So let's hear one more question here. If there's anyone else who has a question, now's the time to either put it in the chat or raise your hand or come off mute. But let's do this one. Is it from Rena? I'm looking at my bigger screen. I believe it's from Rena. I hope I'm saying her name properly.
Hi,
Thank
Rena.
you for the session. I agree. How can workplace leaders get ahead of these issues? What are the best practices that can be implemented?
Well, that's another big one. Rena, we worked together years ago, Canadian Tire. So it's great to see you again, Rena. I think, look, this is an easy answer, Rena, because we only have a couple minutes, but I think the fact that you as a leader and other leaders are getting attuned to this is part of getting ahead of these issues and sharing this with other leaders. And I think normalizing these conversations a little bit more in leadership spaces is what I'm a little bit of a non-religious evangelist about, right? I think like normalizing the fact that I think these trauma responses need to be in leadership discussions. So I think in terms of some best practices, there's a lot more deep stuff in the book, Rena, but I think a couple of the important practices or some of the things that I talked about with Shed at the top of the hour are I am an advocate of starting with where you are and starting with some simple trauma sensitive strategies that you can implement. Thumbs up, Rena, to that. I think starting with where you are, particularly the culture piece and having some meeting hygiene. There's some real simple things that you can do in the book. There's particularly a chapter that I think is something you can apply to different teams, about 6 different culture changes that you can make, including check-ins, including slowing down, how you can do that, including debriefs and what that looks like, including collaborating on workload management. You can't always control the workflow, especially in high stress environments, but you certainly can create new workplace models to collaborate a little bit more with your team about how that workload gets experienced. So I think those are a few things that are often overlooked. They're really important, and I think that they can shift the culture considerably.
Yeah. I think we all know that bumper sticker, that cliche poster of like, be kind to others. You never know what they're going through. And it's like, yeah. And I recently heard when you're in the car, if someone's driving slower than you, they're an idiot. And if someone's driving faster than you, they're a maniac,
Yeah.
right? Which is so true. But it's also just this. When we're in our vehicles, there's the abstraction of I don't need to treat them as the human being they
Right.
are. They're the idiot Ford Explorer, right? Or the maniac, Land Rover, whatever it might be. But just this breath, slow down, check in, and respond rather than react.
Exactly.
Cool. We have one more, and then Adriana will let you land this plane. It's a final question from Rika, and I think it's a really great one because it's landed in the reality of what so many of us are going through day to day. So this is connection to the previous question on budgets, and I read budgets both money, time, all resources. Is there really such a thing as no budget, or is it just a priority desire question? I truly believe that there will always be a budget for what is important. Rock on, Rika. What do you have to say there, Adriana? And then I'll pass it over to you to land this plane.
Yes. Rock on. Yes. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations I've worked with, there's a culture when it comes to budgeting often there's often a culture of what is prioritized and what is deprioritized, depending on the industry. And since I work cross industry, I see different kind of trends. But for example, the UN organizations we've worked with in Tarika together, often there's like a programmatic focus, like other folks are important, the programs are important. Putting any budget into individual well-being, and this goes for a lot of nonprofit organizations too, is selfish, or like, so there's a bit of a culture of that. And I think what I wrote this book for is and why I wrote the business case chapter, is to get folks to understand, even in the corporate sector, that it's not just a nice to have, but it actually helps programming. There's actually a lot of statistics that it helps reduce turnover, retention, especially in this day and age. You said a lot of young people coming in that value different things in the workplace. You want to keep people. You got to keep up with the times in terms of the values that your employees have. So I think there's a lot of really important budgetary business case reasons for prioritizing well-being, prioritizing trauma sensitivity. We just kind of need to reach maybe the skeptics in the room and get to the right people and the right leadership so that they understand how it can impact their work better.
I do think, notwithstanding systemic or cultural challenges, but there is an opportunity for all of us to choose to be the leader that we wish to be. And even without budget, I'm getting more hearts. I'm so glad you agree with me, Adriana. This is wonderful. I do believe that, sometimes there's a belief that, if I want a leadership development program, I need tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands
Right.
of dollars, if not more. No, it can be the right book in a book club and the right team or the right people who just raise their hands, right? And it can be this book or it can be another book of like, hey, team, let's read through this, a chapter a week or 3 chapters every 2 weeks or whatever, and we'll have a lunch and learn. No budget, bring your own lunch, whatever, and let's just have this conversation. And all of a sudden, you have a capacity development of trauma-informed, trauma sensitivity, psychological safety, whenever it might be.
Exactly.
Adriana, I want to pass over to you to land this plane in the last minute here. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for the opportunity to help host this conversation. It's a true joy to do so. I'm going to pass the spotlight over to you to help share some closing words where people can learn more, all the fun things.
Okay, Shed, thank you so much. Very grateful to you too, and to everyone who showed up here and your great questions. So if you want to stay on the line, I'd love to land this plane, as Shed says, with one final moment together. We've talked about a lot of deep things, right? If you wanted to sum up a key takeaway, I like to say with my trainings, like you got a backpack and you have one thing you're going to be taking away with your team, one word, it could be one thing that you're taking away, one aha moment, one percolating question, please feel free to go off mute, share it with me or share it in the chat. That's one thing I wanted to ask you. So if anyone wants to share that before we close, I'd love to hear. And both. Inspired. All right. Both and kindness. I think we're going to have a lot of both anders here, Shed, at the end of today's session.
Whoops.
Thanks, Ellen. Great. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm aware of the time, so I just wanted to thank you so much for all being here together. If today resonated, and if you want to go deeper, the book is available. It's available everywhere you buy your books online. You can go to algconsulting.ca/book. I'll just put it right here in the chat if you haven't picked up your copy. Feel free to go. And if you think there's a leader who needs to hear it, feel free to pass it their way. You can also reach out to me if you want to talk about working together. If you think that your team could use a little bit of this, I'd be glad to talk further. So that's a little bit from me. Other than that, this conversation will be recorded and shared. So if someone in your network needed to hear it, you can pass it along. It will be public. And if not, I just wanted to say thank you so much for showing up today, for showing up for this work. We're building a movement together. It's just the beginning. And I want you to take good care of yourselves and your teams. And I bid you adieu. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Your music is cracking me up, Shed.
Nice. Yeah, we can stop the recording if you like.
Yes, let's stop it.